Hey, good morning, guys, or evening. I don't know what time zone everybody is tuning into. Another little car video. This time I put the microphone on, so I hope it's a little better, a little easier to listen to. Like I said before, it's kind of busy in the shop, so it's not super easy to work and make the videos. So I'm going to be doing a bunch of these to keep in touch with you guys. And of course we're filming content every day, but it's just the editing and getting the quality right, so we just don't have videos that don't really show anything. So it usually takes like 2 or 3 days of wrenching to have enough material for a good video. So it's difficult to keep up the ratio that I had in America, both with the workload and with the time it takes me to edit. But these things are pretty easy to make. Just ride with me in a car and we'll talk drift cars or race cars or whatever. So somebody sent me a question. It was actually a couple weeks ago already. And it said, I sometimes hear you say a mission to the moon in interviews or in these podcast style videos with regards to building a drift car. So I understand that it can be a little bit confusing, because you could think a mission to the moon means taking your car to the track and it's a lot of effort, which is one way of looking at it. Or you could say it's just difficult to build a car, so there's a lot of things involved, and it could be a mission to the moon in that way. But that's also not what I mean. So what I mean with a mission to the moon, referring to the build of a car, is that certain things are very difficult to redo. So if the astronauts go to the moon, when they're up there, you're there. All the stuff that you have with you, that's what you have. And that's in a way also how you build a car. So there are certain things that you can't just easily change. So let's say that the astronauts are working on Earth and something breaks on the space shuttle, they could fix it or whatever, or the space shuttle, whatever the hell those things are called these days. They don't even go to the moon anymore, but just for the analogy. But when you're up there's no quick fix. There's no easy way to solve your problem unless going all the way back. And going all the way back, that's what I'm actually talking about. So if you would regard the starting point of building a car as Earth and the finished car as the moon, that's kind of what I'm meaning. So you don't want to go all the way back to Earth. You don't want to go all the way back to the start with things. And everybody's working on a budget. So you'll hear me say a lot of things on these videos just get a quick change and get this and get that. And I understand that not everybody is going to spend $3 or $4 for a differential and all that. So I understand that. So it's just if you're working on a budget, you need to make choices. And even the biggest FD teams and Formula One teams, everybody works on a budget. So there's nothing wrong with that. When you look at the budget aspect of things, it's going to be very important to keep the whole lunar landing, the mission to the moon thing, in mind. So if you look at an engine build, for instance, let's say that you're building a motor and you've taken it completely apart until the last bolt, and you decide to leave the rod bearings in, for instance, because the rod bearings look so good and it's so fine, and I'm a little bit scared of measuring and I don't know which one to get. Or in 2022, it's actually also a factor if you can actually get the stuff. So let's say that you leave the rod bearings in the car, which are, in the case of a BMW motor, maybe 20 years old or 25 years old if you're building a motor, which saves you, I don't know, $250-$300, because you're just gonna do, or some guys will even reuse the bolts that go in the rods. But let's say that you save $300, but that $300 you can never revisit it. So going back and spending that $300 is gonna cost you a lot more in the future, because you need to go all the way back to Earth. You need to go all the way back to a bare motor to do that. For the rod bearings, obviously you don't have to take the whole motor apart, but for the main bearings and stuff, there's just no way to do it without going back to square one. So you could do rod bearings later, but for the analogy, like you have to go pretty far. You're not going to do rod bearings on a racetrack, and when the rod bearings go, you're done. So you need to take the crank out and just be certain. So one of my friends had an ethanol powered car, really powerful car, and they started it up many times during an event, because every time when somebody would arrive, like a new driver would come to the paddock, they would be like, hey, did you see my new car? I'll start it up for you, it sounds sick. And he started the car up like 5 or 10 times and didn't really warm it up, so there was so much ethanol in the engine oil that it threw the rod bearings immediately. And then they were like, hey, we're going to change the oil and we're going to see if we can do the rod bearings, but that, like on the event, but that's not really a solution, of course. Because you really want to inspect the crank and make sure that everything's correct, like when something happens like that. So that's like the mission to the moon aspect of that. It's $300 that you're saving, which is if you run cheap tires, it's like four rear tires. So you're saving 4 tires by not doing the rod bearings. But you can never go back and spend that four tires worth of money and have the same result. And that's like kind of always the advice that I'm giving to people. You build a car from the inside out. So the stuff that you don't see, that's where the value is going to be, because you can't revisit it very easily. If you look at my black sedan car, M50 turbo, that car is built a lot cheaper than the V8 E46, and the reason for that is that it's going to be used for different things. So for instance, the Nürburgring Drift Cup, it doesn't have walls, so you don't really need a cut-off rear end of the car, and a couple of those events. So that car is like a normal steel body in the back. So that's like a little bit of a budget build compared to the V8 coupe. So if you look at that car, you'll see that it has like steel doors that are cut out. It doesn't have like the crazy Kevlar body kit that's on the coupe. There's a lot of time went into that car, but still, like it's a relatively simple car from the outside. It has wider rear fenders, but like I said, it's still like it actually has the original rear bumper and the original rear bumper structure and all that stuff in it. But where the money was spent on that car is on the internals of the motor. So the motor was complete, everything, even the surface of the intake and the exhaust on the head, it was all decked. And the best of the best bearings went in there, and I had like 4 cranks that I choose the best from. I had 3 motors that I choose the best from after machining. So that's like, that's something you don't see, because people just see an M50 motor in that car and like, oh, M50 motor, which could be a €200 motor over here. Like I've got some of them. I bought whole cars for €1,000 with that motor. So you can't really tell where that money went. Whereas a lot of people will run cold turkey, run a standard M50 motor, don't do anything, like don't even do ring gaps, and boost it, and they'll put like cooler wheels than mine on it, put cool graphics on, and the look of the car is really cool. They may get it like a Huxley body kit or some cool stuff, and if you put the cars together, then their car looks a lot cooler than mine, because mine's just a black paint job, no effect paint or no flake or whatever, just normal BMW M3 wheels. So, but like I'm saying, like usually when that happens, those guys have spent the money on the outside of the car, so they almost built the car from the outside in. So they're driving the car and like, hey, I've got rod knock, or hey, we've got huge problems with the intake temperature or detonation, or all kinds of things, and they'll find out like, hey, maybe I should have gotten a better set of injectors, or maybe I should have gotten a better ECU, or in the worst case, it spins a bearing and you lose the crank, and it could even throw a rod and you lose the whole motor. So I like to build my stuff from the inside out, so the parts that you don't see, that's where the money goes. Obviously I prefer to do everything, so to do it all right, like in the V8, like that's a build motor, that's a whole car, like you can't do anything more on a car than we did on the V8 car, but that's not always the car that you want, and it's certainly not always the car that everybody has the means to do, and not only the means in terms of finance, but also the means of building it in your shop and stuff. So it's like a big part of drifting culture is trying to save money, and I actually, after the Drift Weeks, I really agree with that. It makes a lot of sense to spend more money and time driving and have a little bit more simple car, less tire wear, less things breaking, Like if you have a full race car, like a racing motor, racing transmission, all that stuff, racing clutch, it's way more labor intensive than like my Drift Week M3, which basically goes and goes and goes. But even on the Drift Week M3, that's also built from the inside out. So if you look at the outside of the car, you just see an E46 M3 with wider control arms. It even has the standard wheels. But what went in there, like if you look at everything, like the clutch and the reinforcement of the rear axle, all the things that we've done preventively on that car. Of course, everything on the suspension is uniball. We've done a lot of the bearings and the joints on in the rear axle of the car. So that's built in a way also built from the inside out, and that's how I like it. Like that's my way of doing it, because like I said, it's a mission to the moon. When I would have my Drift Week car in America, driving it on a track, and something would go wrong, like let's say the rear axle attachment points would tear out or whatever, there's no way for me to easily do that stuff on Drift Week at all. So that's what I'm meaning with a mission to the moon. It's not like going to the track or whatever. It's the actual process of building the car, and things you can't easily go back to, things you can't revisit, as it's called. So let's say that you're building a car and you're like, hey, I have a certain budget. Let's say you have 30 grand, and there's going to be guys that are going to spend 5 grand on the body kit, 3 grand on the wheels, and you're going to get the chassis for like 10 grand. So you're for instance, you're on 18 grand, and you have to do everything else, like the ECU, the seats, the harnesses, the cage, the painting, everything from that money. Then usually you'll run out of steam, and guys will be like, yeah, but my buddy runs a turbo motor like that. He has a stock unopened motor, but like nobody tells you that it's actually the 4th motor that he was running. There's a guy in Europe I won't mention any names, but he runs BMW motors with huge power. And he's saying like, no, I never have any. He also sells them to clients like, no, I never had any problems with them. I run like 5 seasons with them. And then I talked to the guy who painted his cars, who said like, what do you mean he does 5 seasons with them? I always help him when we swap motors, and he uses like 3 motors for a season. So there's also a really big difference between Instagram and Facebook, what people say and what the actual truth is. And then they'll say like, yeah, but then my wastegate got stuck, or then this and that, and doesn't really count, or then like we had an oil pump failure, it doesn't really count for the motor. Well, it does. And I put brand new oil pumps on my cars all the time, because you know, that's another thing. Like you could go back and change an oil pump, but you're not going to go back and change an oil pump on an event. So and things that you can change easily, I'm going to get a lot of people are going to hate me for this. So things that you can change easily, let's say things that the astronauts could change on the moon, is things like fenders and wheels and maybe a muffler. So let's say that you're building a car and you're like spending $1,000 on a super rare HKS muffler or something like that. I understand that, but if you spend that kind of money on a muffler, and that's totally fine. Like I love that stuff. Like it makes cars sound good, and you may be like I'm like crazy about certain parts that I really want to have on the car, and there's guys that like certain other parts, like certain body kits. And I'm like, I respect that. I love that. I wish my cars were a little more stylish, so they had a little more. But I don't know everything there is to know about body kits and stuff and other rare stuff. Like on Drift Week, guys are like, I'm running this super rare kit, and I'm like, okay, it looks cool, but I didn't know it was rare at all. Like, okay, and they spent like 5 grand on a couple of over fenders and a front bumper. So I'm not really that guy. I wish I was sometimes, but I'm not. So my cars are always a little bit more like race cars. That's why I'm really happy with the guys in Long Beach who made like the shiny rainbow decals for the Drift Week M3. Because it makes it look a little bit more like a drift car. But my cars always basically look like race cars that drift. Like I don't have that whole style thing going on. Although there's 2 new cars that we're building where we're absolutely getting that style thing going on. So stay tuned for that. So the point of this whole story is that I see a lot of guys that build from the outside in. I understand it's also a good lifestyle. So drifting is also about style. It's also important that stuff looks good and that it looks cool. Sometimes you see guys do really sick stuff with some winter beaters. So guys in some kind of country, doesn't matter if it's Eastern Europe or Scandinavia or wherever, somewhere, and they'll do really cool shit with a car that really looks stupid, you know, like really a missile car with like steel wheels and like just a standard car where they put a handbrake in. And of course it's cool, but it's also like almost like a funny factor. So it's like not people are like, oh, that guy's got skill, but it doesn't really look sick. And if I see some of the guys like the animal style guys and some of the Japanese drivers, and the cars look sick, you know, and that's what I like. So it should be both. It should be looking cool and doing cool stuff, and then that's like the holy grail of drifting. That's what you really want to do. So I'm definitely not saying don't style your cars and it's stupid and you don't have to run cool wheels and blah blah blah. But if you're spending $1,000 on some super rare muffler, which is mostly about the sound and the look of the car because it doesn't really affect the performance, you really should have done rod bearings and all that stuff and at least have the motor stripped and everything, because that's the mission to the moon, because that's something you can't revisit when you're up there on the moon when the car's finished. Whereas a muffler or wheels, like you can change a pair of wheels in 1 minute. So I'm a little bit more about that way of building, and that's what I mean when I say a mission to the moon. And it's also the way with like the drivetrain. So let's say that we touched upon this in the other video, the other podcast thing, about starting from the back, which is like the whole differential and transmission thing. So we have a lot of clients that come to me that say like, hey, we keep failing these transmissions, although everybody said they can't fail, and all that kind of stuff, and what should we do? And then you run into a whole domino of things. So if you run a certain transmission, you need to run a certain prop shaft. If a prop shaft, you want it to be a one piece, so you need to make a sliding assembly. If you, let's say you use a BMW gearbox, or even some of the Tremex, they have like the rubber disc behind the transmission for the prop shaft. And if you run that, it's going to be a lot more difficult to run a single piece prop shaft. Although when you run an American transmission, although Tremec is American, but like American style with the slip yoke, the piece that slides into the transmission, it's very easy to make a one-piece drive shaft. It's going to cost you 30-40% less to make a prop shaft, to make a really good 1,000 horsepower prop shaft for that style of transmission. And it's the same with the quick change. People say like, hey, I keep breaking these diffs, GTR diffs are getting so expensive, what about the quick change? I'm like, yeah, but you need the subframe, you need the axles and all that stuff, and you need to revisit all that because they've had some kind of axle solution. They had some axles made. So there's a shop that sells drive shafts and they're on $1,000 or $1,500. There's no way that's a good drive shaft. It's just not possible. Like the components that we put in drive shafts cost way more than that. And I buy them by bulk. So we buy lots of them. We manufacture certain parts inside the CV joint ourselves. There's no way you can make a set of 1,000 horsepower axles for $1,500. It's just not true. We've had some of them in my shop. One of my clients asked me for a quote for drive shafts. We gave him the quote. He's like, you're a little high. I'm like, yeah, but like I'm making very little money. I'm making 10% profit on these axles, so it's take it or leave it. We just make them for our quick change clients, so we have a turnkey package. And he went on and bought like $1,000 worth of axles, which is like 900 euros. And there's just no way that's going to work. And he bought them, he put them on the car, and on the first event it failed. He said, okay, we're not taking this car back home, take it to your shop and check it out for us and put your axles on. I pulled the axles off, and it's a Chinese CV joint, and like there were all kinds of imperfections of the production process inside the components of the CV joint. One of them fell way looser than the other one. It's just not good, you know. And a good pair of axles will start at like 1,700 euros, which is around $1,900 or $2,000, for instance. And because that's going to be an axle that somebody makes like 10 or 20% on, although the $1,000 axle, somebody's going to make 600 on them because they cost like $300-400 to make. And I can't even make a CV joint for under $300. So that's the difference, and that's like the revisiting part. So you're trying things out with the GTR diff that you bought for maybe for $2,000, but it breaks or something else happens to it, or the bearings go out, or you can't get the bearings, so you can't get anything for it. And you're like, hey, this really doesn't make much sense. Let's go to a quick change. But then for the quick change, you need to change the subframe, you need to change the prop shaft, you need to change the drive shaft. So that's also a thing. Like revisiting that is going to cost you way more than that, and you have a broken GTR diff. So the diff is worth a lot less than what it was when it was correct. So you're entering a whole domino of things just because you're changing it later. And also there's time stress. So it's going to happen at an event. You're like, damn, I don't want this to happen on the next event. how are we going to solve this? And I need a quick change like right now. So we need to get like, it takes us time to manufacture stuff. Like I said, my shop is pretty busy. So it's not like we can drop everything and start making somebody a custom set of axles and have them done in 3 days. Like it's going to take a couple weeks, especially with the hardening process and everything. So that's kind of a thing. With the mission to the moon thing, like spend your money on the things that you can't revisit easily, like the stuff that's back on Earth and the stuff that you could change when you're on the mission, when the car is working. Like if you really have a budget, save on that for some reason. Let's say that you only have 20 grand or even 10 grand. Make sure that that you get a good quality turbo, and that you get a good quality manifold and all that kind of stuff, and a good transmission and a good clutch. And yeah, then it may look a little bit more boring with like a maybe no body kit, or like a simple body kit, or more simple wheels, or second-hand wheels, or whatever. But like the safety should always be really, really well done, like the belts and how they attach and everything. Super important, not only for yourself, but you're also jeopardizing the racetrack. If something happens, then the racetrack, it could have ramifications for the racetrack. So make sure that the safety is absolutely number one. And then like the next prioritized thing is going to be stuff that you can't really easily change. So like I said, like rod bearings, but also main setup things, like how good is your mapping? Are you going to just drive around on the street and map it a little bit with your buddy who's done it like 2 times before with his laptop? Or are you going to pay somebody with a really good dyno that's going to be able to hold their car down for 5-6 minutes on 4,000 RPM when you make like a perfect mapping for that car? Like that's where you really should be spending your money on, because you're not going to remap a car when you're on an event, so that stuff should be done back on Earth when you're building the car. So that's kind of the explanation on the mission to the moon thing. I've arrived at my destination. I hope you guys had a good time. Comment below if you want to hear something else, something else explained that you may not understand, or other subjects that you may found interesting. Have a great day.
Don't forget to take a look at our website as well, einzel.nl. We ship worldwide, of course, Wisefab, Feel Suspension, our own brand Einzel, gearboxes, quick change differentials, axles, all kinds of things. A lot of fabrication components, of course, air jacks, subframes for quick change, you name it. Drop us an email and we'll hook you up.